Hello, I'm Lucy Gordon, a Director in the Employment team at Walker Morris, and with me today is Shabana Muneer, a Director and Head of Immigration at Walker Morris. Both Shabana and I do a lot of work with businesses in the care sector, so social care and retirement living, and we're both very aware of the acute recruitment crisis in the sector at the moment. There have been some recent government developments which might mean that the good news is on the horizon for employers. So Shabana, what are the changes?
Okay, so just stepping back one stage, in August of last year, the Home Office introduced a new visa for health and care workers. And this was in order to facilitate medical professionals and professionals in the care sector coming to the UK from overseas to work for the NHS or for an NHS supplier or in adult social care in certain skilled roles. And the benefit of introducing this specific visa for health and care workers was intended to be that the visa process would be cheaper because there are reduced visa fees that apply for this particular visa category. There was no immigration health surcharge applicable, so again, there's a cost saving as compared to standard sponsorship. And also the application process was intended to be much quicker, the idea being that employers in the care sector and in the healthcare sector could recruit foreign workers more cheaply and at a greater speed than they would otherwise be able to do under the standard skilled worker route. Now, in terms of the more recent changes, back in December, the government announced that the health and care worker visa would be extended to cover certain categories of roles that previously weren't covered. So that effectively means roles such as care assistants, care workers and home care workers are now capable of being sponsored under the health and care worker visa, whereas previously this wasn't the case. And that effectively means there's a broader range of roles that now can be sponsored from overseas, where employers in the care sector are facing skill shortages here in the UK.
Yeah, and that's a real problem at the moment, isn't it? This recruitment crisis that's ongoing. So what's caused that situation and why is it such a problem at the moment?
No, absolutely, it is a huge issue, and you only really need to switch on the news or pick up a newspaper to read about the acute skills shortages and the acute staff shortages across the care sector. And really there are a myriad of factors which have contributed to this, but I think two key ones are probably the two most hated events, if we can call them events, in modern times. One is Brexit and the other is COVID. So if we look at Brexit and the impact this has had, before the end of the Brexit transition period, which ended at the end of December 2020, because of the principle of freedom of movement, European workers could come and live and work in the UK without any restriction and without their employer having to undergo any kind of immigration process additional to what would apply to a UK worker. And this effectively meant that employers in the care sector had a huge pool of resources in these 27 other EU countries that they could tap into to fill vacancies in the UK without any additional cost and without any additional administration. That changed at the end of the Brexit transition period, and since then, European nationals who don't have status under the EU settlement scheme or who don't have an alternative immigration permission to live and work in the UK now need to be sponsored under the points-based immigration system. Only certain skilled roles and sufficiently well-paid roles are suitable for sponsorship. So that has had a huge impact because all of a sudden this huge labour market is no longer quite as easily accessible as it previously was. The second big factor, I think, in all of this is COVID for a number of reasons. Firstly, at the start of the pandemic, lots of workers in lots of different sectors went back home and haven't returned. So lots of overseas workers were lost in that way. And secondly, you will have lots of workers who are isolating at any given time because of COVID, so are physically unable to come into work, even if they are in the UK. And we've also seen thousands of workers in the care home sector having left the profession in recent months since mandatory COVID vaccines were introduced in November of last year because they didn't agree with the mandatory vaccine rule. And therefore, what was already quite a where there were already shortages, these have just been exacerbated over recent months.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen reports of, care providers refusing new contracts, or returning existing contracts, or refusing, refusing residents to care homes because they just don't have the staff to meet those needs.
Yeah.
And therefore, the possibility of now being able to recruit from further afield, from outside the UK, to plug those gaps is going to be welcome news, I think, not just for the care providers, but also for the families and for the people who are in receipt of the care, who at the end of the day are not interested in whether the person providing the care is from the UK or from overseas and whether they've got a visa or not. They just need the work to be done.
Absolutely. And it has a big knock-on impact on the NHS as well, doesn't it, in terms of discharging patients to care homes if there is actually the resource there to look after them. So in terms of how this could potentially benefit those in the care sector, it sounds like this could be really significant.
What this means for employers in the care sector is that they can now recruit from much further afield than just the UK and Ireland, as was previously the case for these types of roles. And ultimately it means they should find it easier to fill vacancies, provided that they have the relevant infrastructure in place to support overseas nationals coming to the UK for work.
So what practical steps do employers need to be taking if they want to take advantage of these new opportunities?
So in terms of practical steps, I think the first thing to bear in mind is anybody coming over to work in the UK under this extended visa route will need to be sponsored by an employer in the UK that holds a sponsor licence, and that's effectively a permit that's issued by the Home Office, and which permits them to then sponsor people to come in from outside the UK. Where an organisation already has a sponsor licence in place, there is still a bit of homework to be done to make sure that licence is fit for purpose and that the key personnel under the licence know what they're doing, know how to administer the licence, and know what the obligations that are connected to that licence entail. But I think probably more importantly, for any organisation that doesn't already have a sponsor licence but thinks, actually, I could do with recruiting care workers or home care assistants from outside the UK because I can't find people in the UK who are able or willing to do the work, the first thing they really need to do is start looking at getting a sponsor licence in place. Now, the Home Office will only grant a sponsor licence to an employer that it deems to be honest, genuine and reliable. So there is an application form to complete, but there's also lots of supporting documents that the Home Office wants to see to demonstrate that it's a lawfully operating organisation in the UK and that it's going to be an organisation that can fill its sponsor licence obligations. And that does take a bit of time to gather together. So from experience, it can easily take a month or two for a client to gather all the supporting documents and submit their application. Once the application is submitted, the Home Office standard processing times are 8 to 10 weeks for this type of application. But actually what we're seeing at the moment is they are experiencing very high volumes, understandably, not just from care sector employers, but from employers across lots of different industries which are facing recruitment shortages at the moment. And therefore, the standard processing times are not always being met. It may well be that an application takes longer than 8 to 10 weeks to be decided. It is possible to pay an extra fee and get what's known as a priority service, so have the application decided in 10 working days. But again, in reality, those priority services are very limited. And from my recent experience, clients are struggling to get onto them. So I think if this is something which your organisation is interested in pursuing, I certainly think it's worth getting the homework done sooner rather than later and getting the sponsor licence application in as soon as possible, because it could easily be a good 3 months before you're then in a position to sponsor that first migrant worker and get them here working for you.
And when do we think that the extended visa is going to come into effect? When's that going to?
So at the moment, the announcements from the government suggest that they intend it to come into force from February, so from next month. So what we've seen is the Immigration Minister announcing that certain steps need to be taken to get the infrastructure in place, and that includes things like updating the immigration rules, updating the Home Office caseworker guidance, updating their IT systems to ensure that they recognise these new roles that are now capable of being sponsored. And they've said that they think all of that can be done in February. So whilst we don't have a definitive date yet, that's the date we're currently working towards.
Okay, so if businesses are interested in this, they do really need to get going, particularly if they haven't got a sponsor licence in place already.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And in terms of this kind of being a fix for the resource problem that we have at the moment, is there any way that this is going to be a short-term fix, or is it actually intended to be a longer-term investment for businesses?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the government have introduced, the government have said that the visa applications will be received initially for a 12-month period by these extended categories of people who are now eligible to apply, and that within the 12 months they will review what impact the changes are having on recruitment and staff retention in the care sector, and will then decide on the longer-term future of the extension. But I think the key point to make is, although visa applications are going to be considered initially for a 12-month period, if granted, the visa should run for the duration that a normal visa under the health and care worker regime would run. So we haven't seen any indication from the government which suggests anything contrary to that. Mm-hmm. On that basis, a standard visa can be applied for up to 5 years, which means effectively you could recruit somebody who is then tied to your organisation, in the sense that if they are sponsored by you, then their permission to live and work in the UK is contingent upon their employment by you as their sponsor. Now, obviously, it's open to them to look to a different immigration route whilst they're here, or potentially change sponsors and get a different care employer to sponsor them. But actually, I think in terms of workforce planning, there is probably something to be said for having somebody who is sponsored by you for 5 years, effectively tied to you for 5 years, and it will hopefully provide some certainty and longer-term comfort to employers in the care sector.
I think that's really important, isn't it? Because obviously whenever you take on a new employee, you invest in them, you train them, and actually it does look as though that is a good long-term prospect. So if I'm a care home operator and I'm interested in making use of this new opportunity, what do I need to be aware of? What do I need to think about?
So I think the first thing you need to be aware of is, obviously there are still only certain roles that are eligible for sponsorship, even under the new extended health and care worker visa. So we need to ensure that the particular role you have in mind is suitable for sponsorship. The other thing you need to be thinking about is what salary you're going to offer the role. So there are certain salary thresholds, minimum salary thresholds that need to be complied with. Now, one of the things the government has done is introduce some of these care worker roles onto the shortage occupation list. The shortage occupation list is a list of occupations which the government recognises and acknowledges are difficult to fill from the resident labour market because of skill shortages, and therefore it's slightly easier to recruit for a role under the shortage occupation list than would otherwise be the case. One of the impacts of this is that there's a reduced salary threshold for these roles, which is £20,480. So that is the absolute minimum salary threshold that applies. It might be more for a particular role depending on the going rate assigned to that role, but that's, as a minimum, that needs to be the salary. So employers need to ensure that they're considering all of this when they're formulating their job adverts and looking to go to market overseas for a role that needs to be sponsored. I think also employers need to be aware that there is a cost associated to sponsoring migrant workers. Yes, it's a lower cost under the health and care worker visa because reduced visa fees apply. There's no immigration health surcharge, but there is still a cost. Now, that I think needs to be balanced in reality against the costs of employing agency workers if there are staff shortages. And we've all read the reports about agency fees being extremely high at the moment to cover this type of work. So that's one thing to bear in mind. I think the other thing, obviously, to bear in mind in terms of costs is if the option is sponsor somebody and pay the sponsor licence fee and the sponsorship fee versus turn away contracts and work because we don't have the staff, then I think on balance, sponsorship is probably going to make financial sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of employers getting themselves in the best position to make use of these changes, what should they be thinking about and doing in that regard?
I think the first thing I would be doing if I was an employer in this sector is some workforce planning, which I'm sure the majority of organisations will be doing anyway, will have had to be doing given staff shortages. But I would be thinking about where I think my future staffing needs are, and then looking at where in the world do I think I'm going to be able to find these skills? Where am I going to target my recruitment? Practical things that need to be thought about are things like, how do we ensure that the skills and qualifications obtained overseas are transferable to the UK and are recognised in the UK? How do we ensure that people have the sufficient language skills to come and work here? So that's all of the preparatory work that can be being done.
And how can we help with any businesses that are looking to investigate this route?
So we obviously have extensive experience of assisting employers with making the sponsor licence application, with then assigning certificates of sponsorship to people they want to bring over to the UK from overseas to work, making sure the role is suitable, the salary meets the minimum requirements, etc. As well as also just advising on general compliance with UK immigration law, and that includes advising clients in the care sector. So anybody that does have any queries, we're more than happy to have an initial discussion with them.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Shabana. That was really helpful, and I'm sure will be helpful to lots of businesses. Thank you for watching.